What is the scariest monetary story ever told? The one that's whispered to young economists as they're being tucked into bed to keep them on the straight and narrow, the story they think of when the orange demon moon rises over the horizon, bathing the landscape in a bloody glow. Well, I think Jeff Snider, the head of global research at Alhambra Investments, and I agree on what that story is. And Jeff, I first heard it as a young economist. I was at Camp Womatichik, and it was the middle of October, and we were all sitting around a fire, and our camp counselor, the lead econometrician, he told a story that lasted all night, although it seemed to go on for decades. It was a cold night. It was a silent night, although I thought I heard the hoo-hoo of an owl, the ahwoos of the wolf. I thought I heard screams too, Jeff. And it was called The Proliferation of Products.
Yeah, I heard the same thing, and to me it was equally scary, but my experience was probably a little bit different than yours, since it was basically just reading through FOMC transcripts and academic papers, which I think to most normal people sounds worse than any horror movie ever invented. Can you imagine being stuck in a library with reading nothing but academic papers on the monetary system of decades gone by? I think that's about as horrific as it gets.
Would you rather go through a haunted house or read FOMC statements? I think everyone would go with the haunted house. It would be a tough call for me because I hate haunted houses.
And I hate FOMC statements, so I guess it works out, right? It's scary either way you go, because there's a lot in the FOMC statements as well as the academic papers that you just, you have to think, at first, this can't be real, and second, these are the people who are supposedly in charge of, or at least that's what they tell you, they're in charge of the whole damn economy.
And we're referencing an article that you posted at Alhambra Investments on the blog, and you posted it on October 26th, and it's titled A True Horror Tale. Let's start with what is proliferation of products, and then go into the story itself.
Yeah, I think the scariest part of all of this is that it's a true story, and that true story doesn't start with proliferation of products. Proliferation of products was the phrase that Alan Greenspan used in June of 2000 in one of those FOMC meetings. So it's right there in the FOMC transcript from 20 years ago. And he was referencing a discussion about what the Humphrey-Hawkins requirements that the Fed would have to produce money targets. Now, Humphrey-Hawkins, or the Full Employment Act of 1978, came about because of the Great Inflation, which was Congress telling the Fed, you guys are doing such a horrible job. We are going to require by law that you produce money targets so that we can keep an eye on you folks, because you don't know what the hell you're doing. So here they were in June of 2000. Those provisions requiring the money targets had sunset, and they were debating whether or not they should be renewed and what the recommendation to Congress was. And Alan Greenspan basically said, and everybody agreed, we don't really use money targets because we can't define money anymore. So why bother continuing with it? And what he said was, specifically, the proliferation of products was so extraordinary. And what he meant was that the banking system had used forms of financial transactions in real economic situations that performed the role of money that nobody could really define. They didn't conform to traditional definitions of money. The Fed didn't know what the banking system had been doing. And the proliferation of products that Greenspan was talking about wasn't something that just happened in 1998 or 1999. He's talking about stuff that was going on starting in the 1950s and really caught on in the 60s and 70s. So we're talking about a quote from 20 years ago from today about money going off the rails 20, 30, 40 years before 20 years. So we're talking about a horror story, a true horror story that goes back more than half a century.
And Jeff, as you discuss in the article, and you make analogies to movies and movie structures, and you say, you don't always just jump right into the horror story. There's the buildup of the characters rationalizing away the psycho next door, the noises. And so in this case, we had trillions of dollars when that was real money, not like today, offshore, outside of the system, that people were aware of, but they didn't do anything about it, Jeff. They said, that's not screaming. That's just the howling of the wind.
Yeah, I think, the way you put it is exactly right, Emil, that, in every good horror story, the first act is usually about how do we rationalize, the audience can see the monster or the villain as the monster or the villain, or at least know, in the movie Jaws, that we know there's a shark out there, right? And we're rationalizing away that the fact that the shark that's eating people left and right, and that, it must not be what we think, or, we don't believe your lying eyes. In the monetary horror story, we had this Eurodollar that showed up out of nowhere in the middle 1950s, took off in the 1960s, but it wasn't just, dollar deposits. The term Eurodollar itself is kind of misleading because that referred to a specific form. What we saw in the 60s and 70s was a proliferation of products, as Greenspan said, which meant that was qualitative expansion in addition to quantitative expansion. And those two things went hand in hand, right? Because the proliferation of products meant banks doing all sorts of different things, and doing all sorts of different things allowed them to do a lot more of all those different things. And so it was really letting Frankenstein's monster free into the world and then just rationalizing it as, that's not Frankenstein, nor is it a monster. It's just a bunch of stuff out there that we don't have to be concerned about, which is, the premise of a lot of horror movies.
Qualitative and quantitative. I often make that mistake, and I kind of sort of did it in the beginning of the show. I was talking about the Eurodollar system and that it was trillions big. I always forget about the qualitative part. And in your article, you make an analogy, and I hope we get to it here later, about it's an evolution. But before we get to that idea of evolution, let's talk about the qualitative, and that there are a couple of characters in our scary story, like in every movie, who say, you know what, I don't want to go into that haunted house, or I don't want to go into that spooky mansion, even though the door is open. Why don't we go the other direction? And in this case, that role is assigned to Dufey and Giddy, which we discussed in our last episode, but perhaps not everyone stuck around to the end of that show. So Dufey and Giddy, what do they say? When did they say? What about the qualitative nature of this monster?
Yeah, in terms of the horror movie structure, there's always that one character that pops up, usually the wise, grizzled old guy who shows up and gives you all sorts of exposition that you're missing, and that fills in the monster's backstory. And that's really, there's in terms of our Eurodollar horror story, there's a couple people who fill that role. One that you and I just talked about off air, Robert Russo was the one who studied the monetary system up until the 1980s and made all sorts of warnings about how, this proliferation of interbank networks, that he called them, that was going to come back to bite us someday. Guido Carli, who had been a central banker of the Bank of Italy, Robert Solomon, who was probably one of the wisest guys, playing on his name, one of the wisest international monetary watchers out there. Charlie Coombs, who had been the open market manager for the Federal Reserve in the 70s and in the 60s and 70s, who said, this Eurodollar stuff is playing hell with our monetary statistics. So there were all sorts of, these wise characters who showed up and said, beware of all the stuff you're not paying attention to because it could come back to haunt you. And of course, Dufey and Giddy, what they did was they put, they put a lot of detail behind what Greenspan later called proliferation of products. They actually cataloged the proliferation of products in June or July 1981. They said, look, man, the 60s and the 70s had been a time where the banking system just went nuts, experimenting with all kinds of things. And they listed them, and they showed stuff that caught on. They listed and discussed stuff that didn't caught on, some of the experiments that didn't work, like floating rate notes and Eurodollar, all sorts of stuff. But what they really said was that this proliferation of products, all this financial innovation that's going on, in terms of the monetary system, especially the Eurodollar system, it had made what they said, what they realized was the world's first external monetary environment, which was essentially a cashless virtual system, a reserveless cashless virtual system that operates essentially on whatever banks come up with. If a bank comes up with a certain kind of financial transaction and another bank says, yeah, I agree that's a financial transaction, we now have a monetary result even though there's no money involved in it anywhere. And it was true, not just in terms of the euro currency system, but also what the Eurodollar had meant for other euro currencies, including euros, well, there weren't euros back then, but euro yen and euro other offshore currencies. In other words, what they said was the Eurodollar as its external basis allowed, because of the heavy reliance upon swaps and other forms of these financial products, that you could have these external currency systems in any denomination. So it wasn't just an external dollar system, it was external currency completely.
I'm a little confused on the external part, and I know you've just explained it right now. Is the quote that you referenced, the Charles Dickens analogy, is that referencing what you mean by external? If so, I can read it here.
Yeah, that's what we're talking about external, is the fact that, when we think about a money system or a currency system, we think there should be currency in it, right? There should be something there. There has to be a unit. What we don't understand here is that the unit are not, it's not a dollar. It's not a physical dollar bill. It's not even a digital dollar bill. It's a bank creation that they call a dollar. And so that's what makes it external. It's essentially IOUs of IOUs, right? We're moving beyond the physical world into the digital world and into exclusively a banking world. And in the, you think about it in terms of digital currency and cryptocurrency, the white hat, black hat kind of thing. In the Eurodollar system, banks that participate in it are the preferred providers, and they're allowed to create and transact and redistribute these dollars that aren't dollars, that don't have any dollars anywhere. They're just simply numbers. It's an external system.
Perhaps the most famous ghost story of all time might be, at least in the English language, would be Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. So I'm going to read this explanation because I think it helps put into context it's this somewhat slippery concept. And you interrupt if you want to make a point at any point. Quote, the phrase Charles Dickens used to describe insurance companies can be refashioned quite well to characterize this monetary arrangement. A bank that holds no dollars gets another bank that holds no dollars to guarantee that everyone has dollars. It's all a lie, but it works because nobody ever demands to be presented with dollars. This is amazing that it can work like this. Transactions are simply settled and worked out in the format consistent with that. Bank B used to have a number that said Bank B was owed a certain amount of dollars, but then Bank B lent that number and nothing else, that number, to Bank C so that Bank C could claim an ability to get dollars when neither bank has any interest in obtaining dollars, just the whatever transformation that results from that transactions. Dollars are purely theoretical, thus dollars, in quotes. And is that what you mean by virtual currency?
Yeah, and let's strip this down into a basic, really basic stuff, okay? Let's pretend I'm a bank and you're a bank. I have no dollars because I don't have any dollars. Maybe I'm a bank in Singapore, for example, and you're a bank in the Cayman Islands because you're in the Cayman Islands, right? Mm-hmm. And you don't have any dollars either. Yet I will lend you dollars I don't have in the form of a swap because I say I'm connected to a market for dollars, this Eurodollar market, where in the future, where I'm obligated to give you dollars, I can borrow them in that market. So I have no dollars, but now I say I have dollars, and now you say you have dollars, but in the form of a swap that goes into the future. So I'm saying I have dollars in the future that you can use today because I promise to give you those dollars in the future that I don't have because in the future I will borrow them from the market. That's an external currency market. It's a reserveless system. And what we've done is basically engage in a derivative transaction that is a proliferation of financial products, essentially, which is what I wrote and what Dufey and Giddy were writing. Neither one of us have dollars, but yet we've just created a transaction that's structured in the way that you end up with dollars somehow, even though none of us have any. And it works because accounting conventions, bank conventions, whatever it is, my balance sheet is treated as a monetary balance sheet, and your balance sheet is treated as a monetary balance sheet. I have now an asset, you have a liability, and monetary things get done even though there's no money involved in it anywhere.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the horror, the terror if you look into the system, you realize it's all just built up on confidence, on promises, and that could give you pause. And then, Jeff, at the end, you say that the monster is not just your cobbled together Frankenstein demon anymore, that now it's become a trans-dimensional hyperdemon of some sort. Now that it's a alien meets predator meets poltergeist, because it's forward in time, across geographies. It's beyond the monsters that we were considering, the worst that we could imagine, or the worst that central bankers could ever combat. They need to evolve in order to take on this hyperdemon that exists outside of the borders.
Yeah, and even Alan Greenspan, who's always been portrayed as the wise steward who had control over everything, when you go back and you read some of the things, some of the speeches, I always go back to the 1996 Irrational Exuberance speech, because people read that entirely wrong. What he said was, and I'll repeat it, what he said was, we have no idea if stocks are behaving rationally or not because we can't define money. We can't do anything with the monetary system. Therefore, we have no idea if the dot-com bubble is actually a bubble. And so he's portrayed as that wise monetary steward. But going back to the horror movie format, he's the Frankenstein. He's Dr. Frankenstein. He's the guy who helped create the monster, who ends up committing suicide in the end because he let it free and never warned people sufficiently about it. And that's really, again, you go back into the transcript, you go back in some of the literature, Alan Greenspan in particular in the 90s was always portrayed as, I got this covered, but in private, he was worried that maybe he doesn't. And what happens if we don't have this covered, which was the subject of the June 2003 FOMC meeting when they were debating why Japan wasn't being successful as QE. There was always in the back of at least Alan Greenspan's mind that maybe this money stuff will matter. And I think that's really the horror part of it from the beginning, was that way back in the 60s and 70s, as the proliferation of products was really gaining steam, economists and central bankers decided, we don't need to pay attention to this stuff. We'll just move the federal funds rate around. We'll say that we're targeting inflation. We'll instill all this confidence in the public and the business sector and the financial markets. We won't worry about the details, and we'll just control it from above through these signals of expectations, and everything will just work out fine. Or as we talked about last week, random good luck. Our good luck will just last forever. And that's really, that's a recipe for nothing other than a good horror movie.
Speaking of which, Jeff, as we wrap up, it's Halloween. You've got a bowl of popcorn. It's late at night. You pop in a video. Which one are you watching? What is your favorite horror movie?
I don't think I have one. I don't know the favorite horror movie. That's not really my thing.
All right. Fair enough, Jeff. I don't think anyone's surprised because you're reading FOMC transcripts, and we appreciate it.
Yeah, if you want real horror, there's a lot there. Truth is much stranger than fiction.
Humphrey transcripts. Humphrey Hawkins videos of testimony. That's the horror.